The son of the noted Jedi Masters Barrison and Krinda Draay, Lucien Draay lived his life in the shadow of the Great Sith War waged by Exar Kun in 3996 BBY. His father was killed in the fighting and his mother was left emotionally scarred. Traumatized and racked with guilt over her inability to foresee Kun's fall to the dark side, she dedicated her life to preventing the return of the Sith, founding the Jedi Covenant, an extremist branch of the Jedi Order dedicated to using powers of farsight to predict and prevent this return. However, in her unwavering fanaticism, she effectively abandoned her son. Desperate for his mother's approval, Lucien became a similarly dogmatic member of the Jedi Covenant, serving the organization as an enforcer. When the Covenant's first watch circle received a vision that implied one of their own students may be a future Sith Lord, Draay ordered what would become known as the Padawan Massacre of Taris, the only surviving member of which being Lucien's own student, Zane Carrick. Pursued relentlessly by his former instructor, Zane dedicated himself to undermining and exposing the actions of the Covenant to the Jedi Order at large. Carrick's efforts eventually provoked the Jedi to move against the Covenant. However, Hazen, Krinda's attendant and Lucien's former master, revealed himself to be a powerful Sith acolyte and the true master behind the Jedi Covenant, taking advantage of the chaos and making an open bid for control of the Jedi Order. In the midst of all this, Draay was also confronted with the death of his mother, which very nearly drove the Jedi Master to the dark side of the Force, though he managed to recover himself at the last moment. Utilizing the remote that Hazen had used to control the Republic Navy, Lucien called down an orbital strike and killed Hazen, though he managed to survive. Retreating to a remote moon that he had purchased in secret some years earlier, Lucien Draay reformed the Jedi Covenant, this time based around the ideals of both his mother and his father. Surviving Order 66 and the rise of the Galactic Empire, Jedi Master Obi-Wan Kenobi went into hiding on the desert world of Tatooine, where he watched over Luke Skywalker, the secret son of Anakin Skywalker. Living under the name Ben Kenobi, Obi-Wan became a hermit living on the edge of the hostile Jundland Wastes, regarded by all as a crazy old wizard and avoided by settlers and Tusken Raiders alike. When Luke Skywalker inadvertently delivered a call for help from Princess Leia Organa of Alderaan, Kenobi emerged from exile to aid the Rebel Alliance against the Empire. Taking Skywalker as his Jedi apprentice, the pair journeyed to Mos Eisley Spaceport and hired the smugglers Han Solo and Chewbacca to transport them to Alderaan, though they were intercepted by the Death Star. Forced into a rematch with Darth Vader, Ben Kenobi gave his life so Luke and his allies could escape, transcending the physical plane as a Force spirit, returning periodically to guide Luke Skywalker during his training as a Jedi Knight. One quarter Mira Luca from his maternal line, Lucien Draay was otherwise a typical human male, noted for taking strongly after his father. 37 years old at the time of Hazen's attempted coup against the Jedi, he was well built and remained in his physical prime. A dedicated martial artist, Draay's demonstrations of strength, speed, and endurance were extremely prodigious, even among his fellow Jedi. Subjected to a powerful blast of dark side energy that left disfiguring second and third degree burns on his hands, he recovered quickly and waged a fierce duel with Zane Carrick almost immediately afterward. In short, Lucien Draay is a human tank. Nothing short of a fatal blow is going to take him out of the fight. In his heyday, Obi-Wan Kenobi was but a hair's breadth below what would be considered the apex of human physical fitness. However, his capabilities would decline sharply over the course of his exile. Aged in his early to mid-60s, he remained physically adept enough to manage life in the harsh Tatooine desert, but his physical attributes were negligible compared to other Jedi in his age group. As noted in the novel Kenobi, Ben's physical degradation stemmed from his constant exposure to Tatooine's twin suns, drying him out and causing him to age prematurely, which made training and exercise more and more difficult for him as time went by. However, while Kenobi's strength and stamina were severely compromised, his manual dexterity remained polished, and he still remained spry enough to hold down a serious lightsaber duel with the likes of Darth Vader, despite his inability to hold down a full 20-minute slugging match. Old Ben Kenobi's greater dexterity is a major advantage in his corner, but his otherwise negligible physical attributes leaves him at a disadvantage against an opponent like Lucien Draay. In addition to having youth on his side, Dray's strength and stamina outclasses the aged Jedi Masters to a massive degree. And while I concede that Ben's ability to hold back Darth Vader means that he could likely do the same with Lucien, that is all Ben would be able to accomplish. Lucien Draay gets the physical edge. Lucien Draay was the only Jedi Guardian serving on the First Watch Circle, and was trained for the sole purpose of being a Sith hunter. Much like his father, Lucien was a born fighter, his natural talent with the lightsaber allowing him to develop into a highly capable martial artist. Dray's preferred fighting discipline was Form 1 lightsaber combat, the Shi-Cho style. The first lightsaber form ever developed, and the foundation from which all other forms were built, Form 1 was the tutorial style of the Jedi Order and was exceedingly simple in both its blade work and its disciplines. Also known as the Way of the Sarlacc, Shi-Cho emphasized the use of broad, sweeping strikes focused in on the humanoid body's target zones, which left practitioners of the style well suited for engagements with large groups of assailants. The fundamental discipline that the style was based around was for an initiate to allow the Force to flow through him, guiding his actions. A useful skill for fledgling Jedi Padawans looking to develop their combat skills, to be sure. But when taken to the absolute nth degree, it became something very different. Advanced masters of Shi-Cho would completely release themselves into the chaotic currents of the Force, resulting in a wild and emotionally charged fighting style that relied heavily on randomized offensive swordplay. For these reasons, a dedicated study of Form 1 could pose just as much of a danger to an initiate's psychological stability as could the study of Form 7. When on the offensive, Lucien Draay employed his sword moves with a single-minded ruthlessness and aggression. He held absolutely nothing back when attacking his opponents. combining bold, direct power attacks with blinding speed and agility. However, he tempered this emotional frenzy with a solid level of refinement, bringing a moderate level of precision to an otherwise randomized and chaotic fighting style. In keeping with the practical focuses of his chosen style, Dre was highly effective against large groups of assailants, though to his credit, not at the complete expense of his ability to engage a single well-trained opponent armed with a lightsaber, though more on that later. Addressing Lucien Draay versus Eth Koth, Jen Sarai theorized that Dre likely designed his personal style to combat what the common perception of a Sith warrior was at that time, i.e. a rage-fueled offensive dervish, an idea that I agree with. This mentality is suggested mainly by the technical aspects of Dre's style, as his preferred tactic in single combat was to give way before an opponent's attack, then quickly jump back in and strike at an exposed flank, relying on acrobatic evasions to simultaneously bypass his opponent's attack and get inside their guard, leaving him primed to unleash a quick and devastating counterattack. When driving the attack, Lucien's primary focus was on maintaining his forward momentum no matter what was in his way, deftly changing his attack vectors and taking the path of least resistance. As far as his knowledge of alternative fighting techniques goes, he has demonstrated very little beyond his ruthless integration of unarmed combat. Similarly, while he has used telekinetic attacks in tandem with his lightsaber sequences, such demonstrations were exceedingly rare and were usually limited to battlefield engagements rather than single combat. Additionally, Dre's saber defense was relatively weak, which isn't very surprising as this is an element consistent with Shi Cho. While he has proven himself to be skilled at deflecting sustained blaster fire, his ability to defend himself in single combat left something to be desired. On the one hand, he was highly talented at breaking his adversary's forward momentum by preempting their attacks with his own. But on the other hand, his grand sweeping style left massive openings for others to exploit, which ironically made him extremely vulnerable against the very same tactics he himself employed. Further reflecting the technical aspects of Form 1, Dre's capabilities as a tactician and strategist were simple and to the point. While an expert at combative multitasking, his primary strategy in battle was to simply focus in on a desired target, then smash his way through all opposition in his way to destroy it, eschewing forward thinking in favor of ruthless aggression. On the whole, Lucien Draay was a dedicated and uncompromising offensive duelist. Wild, raw, and emotionally driven, he took massive risks and left himself incredibly exposed, but not at the expense of sophistication. In his prime, Obi-Wan Kenobi stood as one of the greatest sword masters in galactic history, and despite being well past that, he remained an extremely formidable fighter. As noted in the article Fight Saber, Old Ben Kenobi retained his mastery of Surisu, the third form of Jedi lightsaber combat. Developed in answer to the increasing availability of blaster technology, Surisu was a purely defensive fighting style based around the use of tight, efficient movements intended to provide maximum defensive coverage and to conserve energy, maximizing combative longevity. In addition to his continued specialization in Form 3, Ben also proved himself to be a capable Shi-Cho instructor, teaching the Form 1 velocities and practice moves to Luke Skywalker. While there is no question that he retained his knowledge of Ataru, his poor physical condition made employing such an elaborate fighting style exceedingly difficult for him. However, Old Ben's conduct suggests that he was aware of this limitation and worked to circumvent it, switching over from the exhaustive practices of Ataru to a clear application of Shi-Cho to serve as the basis for his offense, as the physical demands were so comparatively minimal. Accordingly, Kenobi's offense was marked by a modest, elegant simplicity, employing direct but concise hack-and-slash blade work to pressure his opponents and keep them from gaining a solid offensive or defensive foothold. While age had effectively killed Ben's agility, his footwork was still refined to the point where he was able to perform his sword moves and positional transitions with both blinding speed and a dancer's grace. Given his continued specialization in Form 3, Old Ben Kenobi's defense remained strong. He retained a high level of skill with blast deflection, that being the practice for which the style was designed to accommodate. Kenobi's saber defenses even held against Darth Vader during their final duel aboard the Death Star, losing the fight but not before holding off the cyborg's superhumanly powerful blows long enough for his allies to escape. Effectively stonewalling Darth Vader for even a short while is not a feat to be taken lightly. However, despite refining his offensive and defensive sequences to such high degrees, Old Ben rarely assumed a dedicated offensive or defensive fighting mode in single combat, instead relying on a cautious push-and-pull mixture of advance and retreat, recognizing and exploiting an opening in the opponent's defenses before swiftly flowing in to strike at an exposed flank. Kenobi also retained some effectiveness against multiple opponents and groups. While he would have retained his skills in the use of unarmed combat, dual blade fencing, and firearms, they, like his overall skill set, would have atrophied and been scaled back. The novels The Life and the Legend of Obi-Wan Kenobi and Death Star shed a great deal of light on just where Old Ben Kenobi stands in comparison to other great lightsaber masters. Life and Legends notes that despite no longer having anyone to spar with on a regular basis, Obi-Wan still kept up on his lightsaber exercises over the course of his exile, which allowed him to maintain such a high level of skill well into his old age. Death Star builds off this by confirming that Kenobi's aforementioned inability to sharpen his skills against other trained Force wielders took a heavy toll on his combat effectiveness regardless. Because, as we all know, relentless practice can only compensate for so much. However, Old Ben Kenobi still remained skilled enough with the lightsaber to pose a serious threat to Darth Vader, who had to rely on an extremely cautious mixture of his middle ring probing style and his inner ring defensive style in order to make any noticeable headway. Towards the tail end of their fight, Vader even remarked that if his attention faltered for even a moment, Old Ben could kill him in the blink of an eye. Given his demonstrated competence with sneak tactics, diversionary tactics, and scare tactics, I think it's safe to assume that Kenobi's tactical ingenuity remained polished. On the whole, Old Ben Kenobi had a high level of skill, but was hampered by his flagging physical condition and the atrophy brought on by nearly 2 decades of not having engaged anyone in a serious lightsaber duel. That being said, he remained a force to be reckoned with. My original plan for this video was to have old Ben Kenobi face off against the Rebels' Grand Inquisitor, and later down the road pair up Lucien Draay with Obi-Wan Kenobi in his prime. However, it didn't take me long to realize that Revenge of the Sith era Obi-Wan Kenobi and old Ben would tear through Lucien Draay and the Grand Inquisitor like wet paper towels, which is why I opted to combine them into one versus matchup. Purely as lightsaber duelists, Lucien Draay and old Ben Kenobi were very different, but they were united by a common tactical approach, tricking their opponents into overextending themselves so they could exploit the resulting defensive lapses and dispatch them in the blink of an eye. Overall, I see Kenobi as being the superior duelist, as Dray's grand sweeping style, coupled with his own frequency to overextend himself, is exactly the wrong approach one needs to take to effectively engage a fighter like Ben. Despite being well past the apex of his abilities, Kenobi's defensive moves are still fast enough to meet Lucien's wild rush without too much strain, and his immediate offensive counters are still fluid enough to disrupt Dray's forward momentum and keep him from committing wholly to offense. This major skill advantage was bolstered by the fact that Kenobi's tactical sensibilities were a lot more refined than Lucien Dray's, whose own tactics amounted to little more than, I see you, and now I'm going to beat the crap out of you. Naysayers will argue that old Ben's inability to withstand Vader's assault proves his inability to withstand Dray's. And while I will concede that there is some truth to this, it must be remembered that brute force was only one contributing factor in Darth Vader's victory rather than the outright cause. During their initial engagement, Kenobi was actually able to counter Vader's application of Djem So, only faltering when his opponent switched over to a more cautious probing offensive, as Vader's precise push and pull mixture of advance and retreat allowed him to pressure Ben's defenses while simultaneously fending off his counters, which, when coupled with his mounting fatigue, effectively made the fight unwinnable. However, while Dre shares Darth Vader's emphasis on strength and power, his technique simply isn't focused enough to pressure Kenobi in the same manner. In fact, if a pure lightsaber duel were to ensue between these two, old Ben would be the only one to accomplish anything, as he would simply tank up and wait for an opening, where Dre would waste everything on a fruitless blitzkrieg assault. So accordingly, Ben Kenobi gets the edge as a martial artist and lightsaber duelist. As a combative force wielder, Lucien Draay once again took strongly after his father, inheriting Barristan Dray's advanced aptitude with basic combative force abilities, but lacking the advanced precognitive powers possessed by Krinda. While this lack of understanding regarding the Force's higher mysteries made Lucien a failure as far as she was concerned, his comparatively basic aptitudes left him well suited for his role as the Jedi Covenant's enforcer. As a combat specialist, force-based physical augmentation was one of his primary skills. Though an expert at enhancing his agility and speed to allow for the performance of such feats as superhuman acrobatics and blast deflection, he was most notable for his enhanced strength, to the point where he was able to overpower and disable an HK series combat droid with his bare hands. Lucien Draay possessed a considerable level of aptitude with telekinesis, and it was one of his most developed and readily used powers. At point-blank range, he was able to rip apart the chassis of an HK droid with a basic push, and on a grander scale, he unleashed a force wave that completely cleared the loading bay of the Jedi Tower on Terrace, among other things scattering and destroying 3 T1 bulk loader droids, a large model of droid noted for its durability. Shortly before he called down the orbital strike that leveled his family's estate and killed Hazen, Draay got Zane Carrick and Griff to safety by conjuring a force blast that threw the pair across town, an act that Hazen himself had mistaken for Zane taking flight. However, despite wielding impressive power, Lucien Draay was not particularly inventive in how he employed telekinesis, relying almost exclusively on vicious force pushes and shoves to stagger and thrash his enemies about. Additionally, while Draay himself possessed refined telekinetic defenses, even managing to maintain a staggering advance in the face of attacks of a similar magnitude, his ability to penetrate the telekinetic defenses of other Force adepts is something of a mystery, as he has only ever been depicted employing his powers against Zane Carrick, a low-level Force wielder with a bit of a penchant for getting tossed around like a rag doll. Considering that the bulk of Lucien's Jedi training was geared towards developing the basic powers he had an aptitude for, rather than broadening his understanding, it isn't a surprise that he never developed an aptitude with energy-based Force abilities, which in turn left him completely defenseless against such attacks. While Draay's telepathic abilities were, by his own admittance, negligible compared to his contemporaries, his entry in the Knights of the Old Republic campaign guide does attribute him with skill with the basic mind trick, as well as the resistance towards fear effects and mental interference possessed by other masters of his caliber. Similarly, while he was not initially gifted in the use of second sight or farsight common to the Mira Lucas species, following the loss of his eyesight, he gained the power to experience glimpses into the future, including visions of his own destiny. Drafting a comprehensive Force abilities analyses for old Ben Kenobi is a bit tricky, due to the lack of information on him. It's never been established whether or not Force powers can atrophy from disuse, or if they're more akin to a trained reflex you'll never forget, like learning how to swim or ride a bike. Additionally, it isn't established how his decades of meditation on the Force to learn how to transcend the physical plane as a Force spirit would have affected his combative abilities. While there is a possibility that Kenobi's heightened understanding of the Force's higher mysteries strengthened his powers, it is equally possible that his departure from the physical realm would have caused his influence over it to atrophy. However, many of Ben Kenobi's feats and accomplishments strongly suggest that he remained a highly capable, if somewhat limited, combative Force wielder. He retained a high level of aptitude with basic physical augmentation, at the very least able to boost his strength to the point where he was able to compete with Darth Vader's cybernetically augmented strength. While Death Star and the New Hope novelization confirm that Kenobi was capable of boosting his speed and agility in a similar manner, he did not do so often. Likely out of awareness of his lackluster physical condition. He doesn't want to tax his aging body more than he needs to. Revenge of the Sith era, Obi-Wan Kenobi possessed a tremendous level of aptitude with telekinesis. And although Old Ben has never displayed the same raw power or creative applications, that doesn't necessarily mean he's incapable of doing so. Especially if the theory of Force powers atrophying from disuse proves to be false. As a telepath, Kenobi's capabilities remained highly polished, and the Jedi mind trick was one of his most readily used abilities. Additionally, Ben was a master of sound mimicry, an advanced Jedi ability that allowed the caster to perfectly replicate any sound they had once heard, notably using it to mimic the roar of a wild crate dragon to scare away a small band of Tusken Raiders who were attacking Luke Skywalker. Kenobi also retained his skills in the healing arts, which he used to heal Skywalker following the aforementioned Tusken attack. Harder to gauge than anything else is whether or not Ben Kenobi retained his skills with Tutaminis. While he has never demonstrated a conscious use of the power, we must remember that he has never been depicted in an engagement where such an ability was necessary, which owes more to lack of information than an actual lack of ability. Arguably, Old Ben Kenobi's most notable power was his ability to transcend the physical plane as a Force spirit, surviving his physical death and maintaining his individuality. While this ability obviously has no combative applications, it does speak volumes about the strength of the connection the aged Jedi Master has to the life force of the galaxy. As Lucien Draay and Old Ben Kenobi both functioned predominantly as swordsmen, their aptitude with Force-based physical augmentation was tied almost exclusively to their martial arts training, where I've already reached my conclusions. While it is unclear whether or not Ben retained his skills with the Tutaminis ability, this isn't really an issue as he never developed it to the point where he could block lightsabers, and Draay isn't capable of energy-based attacks. Telekinesis is extremely difficult to call, mainly because the upper limit of both characters isn't clearly established. As I've mentioned before, while Old Ben hasn't demonstrated the same telekinetic aptitude he displayed in his prime, that doesn't necessarily mean he is incapable of doing so. Similarly, while Lucien is able to scatter large groups of assailants, devastate his immediate surroundings, and lift extremely heavy objects with casual ease, it isn't clear whether or not he can reliably overcome the telekinetic barriers of adepts of similar power. What is clear is that neither Jedi had a strong inclination for using telekinesis in a serious lightsaber duel, so I think this skill can be safely discounted. Both are Jedi Masters trained to resist external mental influence, and healing trances are almost entirely superfluous in open combat. Sound mimicry may allow Kenobi to distract his foe, but it would not be a deciding factor in this contest. If I were to approach this verdict on the assumption that Old Ben's Force abilities had not atrophied, and he remained just as powerful and skilled as his ROTS counterpart, I would definitely give this to Kenobi, as he employed a wider variety of offensive powers with a significantly greater level of precision and tact than Draay. However, this theoretical advantage doesn't do Kenobi any good, as the development of his powers over the course of his exile is so unclear. No edge will be given for Force abilities. While the title card for this video depicts Lucien Draay wielding Hazen's curved-tilted Sith lightsaber, I only chose the image for its appealing contrast of colors and position to the image I used to illustrate Old Ben. Within the context of my analyses, I'm assuming that Draay is wielding his original Jedi lightsaber, which in and of itself wasn't all that radically different from the one used by Kenobi. Both Jedi Masters carried standard-sized single-bladed lightsabers with blue blades. Lucien favoring a somewhat ornate design with a rounded pommel, where Kenobi's was more rugged and featured a skeletal hand grip along the center. As both weapons functioned to an equal or near equal degree, with the only real differences between them being aesthetic in nature, no edge will be given for armament. Given how restrained and minimalistic Lucien Draay and Old Ben Kenobi are when it comes to using their Force abilities in single combat, this contest is ultimately decided by martial arts training. And in this area, Kenobi holds a sizable advantage, due in large part to the very nature of Forms 1 and 3. Just as Shi-Cho emphasized releasing oneself into the wild currents of the Force, Draay's entire approach to combat was based around non-linear dynamics. Relying on wild and emotionally charged offensive swordplay to either instantly dominate his opponents or trick them into overextending themselves and creating openings for him to exploit. As I've mentioned, while this high-risk, high-reward approach left Lucien well optimized to engage tactless offensive powerhouses, it is the worst possible approach one could take against a dedicated defensive fighter like Old Ben. A true master of Surisu knows that the best way to maximize one's combative viability was to minimize the body's exposure as much as possible. Relying heavily on quick reflexes and fast positional transitions in order to overcome the rapidity with which a blaster could be fired and a lightsaber guided by the Force could be swung. It all goes back to the quote from the Jedi Battlemaster Skarch Vanuk from the Jedi Path, which, in my view, summarizes this contest as a whole. Those who wish to study Form 3 are advised to practice their meditation, for Surisu is the most inwardly directed of all the forms. You are to be the calm eye of the storm as your enemies rage about you. Ben only ever ran up against a brick wall when he was forced to contend with fighters who tempered their brute strength with a cautionary push-and-pull mixture of advance and retreat. Something that was well beyond Draay's abilities, due to his lack of creativity. He doesn't attempt to undermine his opponent's saber guard with clever swordplay, or fall into a purely defensive posture to wait them out. All he does is come crashing into his enemies with everything he's got and hope for the best. Aside from maybe the level of single-minded commitment he put into his attack, Draay wasn't bringing anything to the table that Ben hadn't already proven that he could deal with. And everything that Kenobi was bringing on had that level of focus and precision that Draay has repeatedly shown a vulnerability to. Simply put, Old Ben Kenobi possessed a substantially greater level of refinement and skill than Lucien Draay as a lightsaber duelist, and is at the very least able to match his performance as a combative Force wielder. Lucien Draay's physical advantage, while considerable, isn't enough to turn things around. Quite literally, every opponent Ben engaged during the Galactic Civil War was of greater physical ability than himself, and he still managed to contend quite effectively. If this were a lengthy war of attrition, Dre would have the advantage. But old Ben wouldn't allow the contest to escalate that far. Just as with Lucien Draay versus Eth Koth, the battle between Lucien Draay and Old Ben Kenobi would be a masterful display of lightsaber combat and a worthy demonstration of their opposing methods, but it would be a brief affair. Lucien would almost certainly be the aggressor coming on hard, and while his wild frenzy would no doubt put Old Ben on the defensive, it wouldn't be anything he couldn't deal with. Kenobi would simply deflect Lucien's power blows and work in his own counters, conserving his energy and holding out long enough for Dre to make a fatal error that he could exploit. I declare Old Ben Kenobi the winner. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed this kickoff to Versus Series Season 6. As always, you are free to leave suggestions for future battles in the comment section below, and I'll see you guys later.